Hey guys, tonight we find ourselves in the middle of nowhere, and I mean that in the most literal, wind-swept, volcanic kind of way. You're trudging through a narrow path carved into moss-covered lava fields, somewhere in the Icelandic Westfjords. The sun set hours ago, though in Iceland, night is a flexible concept, depending on the month. The air is damp and cold and smells faintly of salt, sulfur, and sheep. The only sounds are your footsteps crunching over gravel and what was that? Wind or something? Whispering? You glance behind you. Nothing, except an oddly shaped rock. Or not a rock. Tonight we're diving deep into the soft-spoken, seriously weird world of Iceland's legal sex ghosts. You heard that right. Not ghost stories. Not erotic folklore. We're talking actual court cases where people claimed under oath that they were being seduced, harassed, or otherwise intimately involved with ghosts. And you probably won't survive this. At least not with a straight face. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know your location and local time down in the comments. It's always fun to see who's listening from Oslo at 3 a.m. or Jakarta at sunrise. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're approaching a crumbling farmhouse at the edge of a fjord. It's abandoned, or so the locals claim. Its turf roof has collapsed in parts, revealing beams carved by hand, likely sometime in the 1800s. Through a small shattered window, you spot what looks like and on it, a shape, humanish. Still, the wind howls again. In this lonely place, stories begin to swirl like the fog rolling off the Atlantic. It was here, or somewhere just like it, that one of Iceland's strangest legends was born. A tale of a man who insisted, firmly, repeatedly, and with more conviction than most people apply to their taxes, that he was being seduced by a ghost. And not in a metaphorical, ghost of my past kind of way. We're talking full-on spectral intimacy. This man, a sheep farmer with a stubborn streak and an extremely detailed memory, marched himself to the local magistrate and demanded the government do something about it. Because, and I quote, well, loosely paraphrase, it kept happening, at night, against his will, and the ghost was very persuasive. Now, Iceland in the 19th century wasn't exactly teeming with social workers, or exorcists, or, frankly, people. So a complaint like this didn't vanish into bureaucratic limbo. It actually got taken quite seriously. You walk into this imagined courtroom, creaking floorboards beneath your boots. The air smells of old wool and cod oil. A stern-faced judge presides over a room where everyone probably already knows each other's goats by name. And here's our farmer, standing straight, nervous but resolute. In his hands, a set of detailed notes about the nightly visitations. Time of arrival, method of approach, level of involvement. Historians still argue whether this case was taken seriously or filed under local oddity, but the paperwork suggests it was handled like any nuisance complaint, like a fence dispute, or a stolen chicken, only with more spectral heavy breathing. Now, Iceland isn't unique in having ghost stories, but it is unique in how many of them have ended up in court records. Some were dismissed, others were debated, a few weirdly were even ruled in favor of the accuser, which leads to a very peculiar legal precedent. The notion that in Icelandic history, ghosts, at least occasionally, could be found guilty. As you sit by a crackling imaginary fire, sipping a mug of something warm, let's pretend it's licorice tea, because Iceland. A passage from the erotic spirit through history by Peter Webb floats into your thoughts. He writes about how societies use the supernatural to process repressed desire. In many places, ghost sex is shameful. In others, like parts of medieval Japan, it's poetic. In Iceland, it's a bureaucratic inconvenience. There's also the question of sleep. Many of these stories come bundled with long, lonely winters and equally long, restless nights. When your only companions are candlelight and howling wind, your mind tends to wander, or conjure, or remember something you wish you hadn't. Which brings us back to this village. You explore more, shuffling past craggy stones shaped like old women hunched against the cold. Locals will tell you those are ghosts turned to rock. Others say they're landvættir, spirit guardians who don't appreciate uninvited guests. And if one of them takes a liking to you, well, Icelandic ghosts have been known to be affectionate. Very affectionate. Just ask Jón Halldórsson, a real person from a real 1880s case, who claimed that a particular female ghost was visiting him night after night. He described her appearance in vivid detail, the scent of her hair, the sound of her voice. Well, you get the idea. The court questioned his sanity. Jon questioned their respect for the undead. He also apparently wrote letters to the bishop requesting moral guidance. The bishop responded, "Avoid temptation." Jon responded with another letter, "She won't let me." You lie back on your mental sheepskin rug, the flicker of imagined candlelight dancing on wooden walls. This story isn't about proving ghosts are real. It's about what people do when loneliness stretches on too long, when grief becomes touchable, when desire seeks a loophole, and when you're too afraid or too enchanted to tell the difference between dream and visitor. You wake again, still nestled somewhere between dream and memory, your mind drifting like low fog over a black sand beach. The Icelandic night hasn't changed much. It's still quiet, still cold, and still full of stories that really shouldn't make it into the legal record, but somehow did. Your thoughts circle back to that stubborn Icelandic farmer from earlier, the one who insisted, night after night, that something was visiting him. Not the kind of visit where a ghost gently floats across the room to warn you about unfinished business. No, this was a much more personal haunting, the kind that left him flustered, sleep-deprived, and, depending on how you interpret the court transcript, possibly rather pleased. But long before our sleep-deprived sheepherder filed his complaint with the local syslumaður, tales like his had already been floating across Iceland like wind over the fjords. They didn't always end in court, but they always ended in raised eyebrows and uncomfortable silences over dried cod dinners. Tonight we travel back even further, this time to 1848, in a snow-blanketed valley just south of Myrdal. You arrive in a creaky turf-roofed cottage where a man named Bjorn, no last name, just Bjorn, because surnames are for city folk, is pacing the floor. He's pale, wide-eyed, and clearly shaken. The fire has long since gone out, and the only warmth comes from a worn woolen blanket draped over his shoulders. Bjorn believes he's being haunted. But not just haunted, visited. Night after night, as the wind howls through the cracks in the walls and the ocean whispers secrets through the mossy hills, he claims something slips beneath his sheepskins. He describes it in detail that would make your grandmother clutch her pearls. Soft hands, warm breath, a whisper that sounds like it's being spoken through water. Sometimes it speaks in Icelandic. Sometimes he's not so sure. He brings this to the sheriff, the syslumaður, with the trembling seriousness of someone reporting livestock theft. And he doesn't laugh, not even once. He even brings notes, dates, times, positions. He's basically keeping a ghost sex diary. Now, the sheriff does what any reasonable 19th century Icelandic official would do in the face of such a problem. He writes it down, nods, and files it next to reports about sheep trespassing and overly aggressive trolls. Because in this country, everything gets documented, even the unmentionable. But what's wild is that Bjorn isn't ridiculed. Not exactly. In fact, some people kind of believe him. You see, Iceland has never quite divorced itself from its otherworldly roommates. From Holdufolk, the hidden people, to sea spirits, land wights, and whispering ghosts, the veil between the natural and supernatural is thin enough to trip over. So when someone claims to be seduced by a ghost, the standard reply isn't, "You need help." It's more like, "What did she look like? Or did she leave footprints?" And Bjorn? He's not alone. Stories of midnight visitors stretch back centuries here. But unlike the malevolent phantoms of other European traditions, Icelandic ghosts are often sensual, not necessarily dangerous, just persistent, insistent, a bit like a clingy ex who also glows faintly in the dark. Historians still argue whether these erotic hauntings were symptoms of extreme isolation, sleep paralysis, suppressed longing, or all of the above. But what remains constant is how vivid the details are. These weren't vague shadows. These were full-body apparitions with preferences, personalities, and sometimes a surprising knowledge of ancient Norse poetry. And while we're on the subject of weird and tactile traditions, let's talk about necropants, nabrak, arguably the most cursed pair of trousers in history. You stumble into a dusty museum in Holmavik, rubbing your eyes. Behind glass, displayed with the reverence usually reserved for holy relics, is a waxy-looking pair of pants made entirely from human skin. Yep, human skin. waist to toes, fully tailored. According to folklore, here's how it works. First, you get a friend, like a really good friend, to agree before he dies that you can use his lower half as fashion. Then, after he's buried, you sneak to his grave, dig him up, and skin him from the waist down in one piece. Slide them on like the world's worst pair of leggings, and bam, you're wearing necropants. But here's the catch. You have to keep a stolen coin in the scrotum to make them generate wealth. Constantly. Forever. As long as you wear them. Now you might be asking, what does this have to do with sex ghosts? Well, necropants were believed to retain part of the dead man's spirit. So if you didn't wear them properly, or stole them without the deceased's blessing, you risked awakening a particularly clingy ghost. And not the scary kind either. The handsy kind. Some stories go further. There are tales of wearers reporting sensations, touches, caresses, the feeling of something there, especially at night, especially when they were alone, especially when they weren't quite sure they wanted company. Peter Webb's The Erotic Spirit Through History touches on this idea that items of the dead, especially those worn close to the body, often become conduits for imagined or not so imagined experiences. Throughout history, people have felt watched, warmed, or even loved by the garments of those who passed on. Iceland just took that to a uniquely practical and slightly disturbing level. And it's not always men experiencing these things either. Women reported dreams, long, vivid, almost luxurious dreams of former lovers returning to their beds in the form of glowing figures or gentle shadows. These dreams didn't scare them. They comforted them. Sometimes they happened in the deepest heart of winter, when the darkness lasted 20 hours a day and grief curled like smoke in the corners of the home. So the question remains, are these ghosts real? Or are they the product of loneliness, memory, and just enough dried fish to tip the mind into fantasy? Historians may never agree. But as you roll over in your imagined sheepskin bed, with the wind pattering against turf walls and a phantom shape curling up behind you like it's done so for centuries, the answer stops feeling important. You're not alone. And maybe, just maybe, you never were. The candle has almost burned itself out, and you're lying there, blanketed by shadows and sea breeze and the soft creak of old wood shifting overhead. Icelandic nights have a way of wrapping around you like a story you didn't mean to hear but can't stop listening to. Especially when that story involves trousers made of human skin, or a love affair with a ghost who insists on spooning. But now, let's walk with bare feet across creaky floorboards into another layer of this peculiar folklore, where the haunting becomes official and the paranormal ends up on the witness stand. Because yes, ghosts in Iceland have not only made the rounds in songs and sagas, but they've also made it to court. Welcome to the only country where spectral activity can be cross-examined. Picture this. It's 1907. A thick winter is frosting the windows of a court building in Safjordur. Inside, the wood stove is barely keeping up with the chill, and a small crowd is gathered to hear a complaint that reads like something out of a fever dream. A fisherman, let's call him Arnie because it's always Arnie, has come forward with a formal grievance. He claims that a female ghost, long believed to haunt the shoreline near his cottage, has begun visiting him at night. Not in a threatening way, not rattling chains or moaning miserably. No, she is, according to Arnie, seeking affection, frequently, and with what he calls intent. Now at first the magistrate assumes this is a joke, but Arnie is earnest, dead serious. He explains that the visits have left him exhausted, his work's been suffering, his nets tangled, his thoughts distracted, his appetite, let's just say, off-kilter. He even describes her in such florid detail, the smell of seawater and lavender, the way her hair always feels damp, the precise temperature of her touch, that a few listeners shift uncomfortably in their sealskin boots. The courtroom goes quiet. Someone coughs. The judge asks, "Have you sought the priest's counsel?" Arnie replies, "He said to pray. I prayed. She came back anyway." Louder. The magistrate sighs, scribbles notes, and orders a statement to be recorded. And just like that, the court of Iceland is treating spectral intimacy as a public concern. Now, scholars still debate whether these records were handled as legitimate criminal proceedings or merely logged as curiosities. Some cases get shuffled away with a vague note like unresolved haunting, while others end with recommendations. Yes, legal recommendations for spiritual intervention, including exorcisms, cleansing rituals, or temporary relocation. Often the ghost didn't follow instructions. There's one particular case, found in a bundle of old court transcripts from the Eastfjords, in which a man filed a complaint not only about the ghost's visits, but about how talkative she was afterward. Imagine being haunted and forced into post-visit small talk. That's just cruel. These hauntings often blended with Iceland's other famously persistent folklore. The Nattrell night trolls, Disir, female guardian spirits, and of course, Huldufolk, the hidden people. Sometimes it wasn't clear who was visiting you, only that they were very interested in human company and didn't mind ignoring personal boundaries. But let's pause here to appreciate how Icelandic culture never treated these things purely as superstition. There's a reason ghost complaints ended up in courtrooms and not just whispered over whale-fat candles. In Iceland, the boundary between seen and unseen has always been more of a gentle fog than a solid wall. Peter Webb in The Erotic Spirit Through History touches on this, noting that in remote societies where solitude is constant and touch is rare, the erotic merges easily with the mystical. A dream can become doctrine. A chill in the spine becomes a visitor in the bed. And once that story is told aloud, especially in a culture that records nearly everything, it takes on a life of its own. Meanwhile, you step back into that imagined court building. You're sitting in the back now, bundled in a wool cloak, watching as the judge frowns at a set of statements. One from the fisherman, one from the local priest, and yes, even one from a neighbor who claims she also experienced something strange in the night, though her story is a little more ambiguous, more yearning than complaint. She describes waking up to a weight on the bed, a soft, humming tune, a kiss that smelled of seawater and ash. Historians still argue whether these accounts should be read as folklore, delusion, poetic metaphor, or occasionally the unspoken grief of losing someone you love so fiercely your memory refused to let go. In a way, these hauntings weren't interruptions. They were continuity, a promise that love or desire didn't simply vanish with death. Which brings us to an entirely different kind of courtroom drama, the people who wanted the ghost to stay. There's one case from the 1910s where the complainant, oddly enough, was not the haunted, but his family. They insisted that their widowed uncle, aged 72, had been behaving strangely. He kept speaking to someone at the dinner table who wasn't there. He bought a second pillow for his bed, and he was overheard humming lullabies to a ghost he referred to as my wife, returned. When asked about it, he calmly explained that she visited him every night and that he was quite happy with the arrangement. He even claimed she was less critical now than in life, which honestly is hilarious. The court debated whether he was unwell, but in the end, he wasn't committed. He was just lonely. And Iceland, cold and poetic as ever, decided to let the ghost stay. As you exhale slowly beneath the weight of these old stories, your breath fogs the window of this imagined courthouse. Outside, the snow still falls. The wind sings through cracks, and you wonder if love is a haunting. Maybe a haunting is just love refusing to die. The wind outside hasn't stopped, and neither have the whispers. You wrap your blanket tighter, not from cold, but because the next layer of Icelandic lore is creeping in like mist beneath the doorframe. Quiet, strange, and curiously warm. Let's step now into the realm where things get blurry, where night stretches long enough for dreams to unspool into memories, and where sleep paralysis opens the door to something intimate. You're lying in a wooden bed, layered in sheepskin and the kind of thick woven blanket that smells faintly of smoked wool and old salt. The fire has died down. Everything is still. And then just as your body begins to drift towards sleep, you feel it. Pressure. Not pain. Not fear. At least, not at first. Just the heavy tingling sensation that someone is there, sitting on your chest or curling up behind you. You try to move, but your limbs refuse to obey. You try to speak, but your mouth won't open. The room is silent, except for breathing. Not yours. Sleep paralysis. Modern science says it's a neurochemical hiccup, a hiccup that's surprisingly common. But in Iceland, where the land is steeped in sagas and shadows, that frozen moment between wakefulness and dream is where the ghost slips in. You're not alone in this bed. Now imagine trying to explain that to your priest in 1724. Or to your grandmother in a fishing village where everyone shares the same sourdough starter and the same two goats. Here's where folklore begins to lace itself into the edges of medical theory. The Icelandic word martröð, from which we get nightmare, has its roots in exactly this sensation. A mara, in Norse lore, is a female spirit or demon who sits on your chest while you sleep. But she's not always terrifying. Sometimes she's affectionate. Too affectionate. She arrives silently, presses herself close, whispers old names you barely remember. Her breath is cold, but her hands are warm. She doesn't ask permission. And when you wake, she's gone. But the feeling lingers. According to The History of Sexuality by Michel Foucault, cultures tend to repress what they can't regulate. And in places like Iceland, where religion arrived centuries after the land was already echoing with sagas and secret rites, these old stories, especially those involving nighttime visitations, didn't die. They simply changed masks. Priests in the 1700s gave long, booming sermons about purity, chastity, and the dangers of sleeping alone. Not because they thought people might sin with each other, but because they feared what might slip through the cracks when you're alone with your thoughts. And maybe a ghost who won't take no for an answer. There's one record from a tiny church near Stykkishólmur in 1779, where a young woman reportedly came to confession every week to describe the same dream, a figure of light, touching her, embracing her, saying her name. She was ashamed, but she was also curious. She asked the priest if it could be an angel. The priest, visibly uncomfortable, prescribed 3 extra hours of prayer and suggested she sleep facing the wall. Historians still argue whether these recurring dreams were symptoms of trauma, repressed longing, or simply the side effects of growing up in a land where the sun vanishes for months at a time. But what's clear is that the stories kept happening, quietly, persistently, like footsteps you hear only after they stop. And it wasn't just women who reported these midnight visitors. One fisherman from Húsavík, in a letter dated 1813, wrote of a man-shaped shadow that lies beside me when I'm between sleep and waking. He hums to himself. He touches nothing, yet I feel everything. He didn't ask for help. He simply asked if others had felt it too. Spoiler, they had. In remote communities, these stories often became shared folklore, intimate but not scandalous, strange but not shameful. The villagers might not talk about them in daylight, but around the hearth with the whale oil lamps flickering low, someone might lean in and say, "Have you ever woken up, not alone?" You're still lying there in your imagined Icelandic bed, eyes half open. The wind taps the window once, twice, like an impatient suitor, and suddenly your thoughts drift back to a more modern time. In 2003, an Icelandic woman made headlines by claiming she had fallen in love with a ghost who visited her in dreams. She insisted it wasn't a haunting, it was a relationship. She described conversations, shared meals, even arguments, and though most dismissed her as eccentric, a few nodded silently, as if to say, of course, who hasn't? Because once the line between dream and ghost is blurred, the story doesn't need proof. It needs only to be felt, like a kiss you barely remember, but still makes your skin prickle. Now let's add a touch of Peter Webb's commentary here. He writes about how in many cultures, sexuality has always carried a layer of the supernatural. Whether it's divine union in tantric practice, or the belief that climax opens portals to the spirit world, there's a long human tradition of tying intimacy to the invisible. Iceland just chose to take that quite literally. And so we return to the bed, to the breathless stillness, to the warmth on your neck that doesn't quite belong to you. Is it a dream, a memory, or something older than both? Whatever it is, you don't turn around. Not just yet. You wake up, if you were even truly asleep, with the feeling that someone was just whispering in your ear. Not words exactly, just the shape of words, like the memory of a voice that once knew your name. But the room is empty, the blanket still wrapped around your legs, the coals in the hearth barely glowing now, and yet that feeling lingers, like the echo of a touch. So naturally, you decide to take this complaint to court. Because yes, in Iceland, you can take a ghost to court, or at least you could, and did, more than once. It's late autumn in the mid-1800s, and you're standing before a local magistrate in a quiet fjord town whose name is entirely unpronounceable unless you grew up speaking Old Norse in the womb. You've got your wool coat on, your hat pulled low, and a face so serious you'd think you were accusing a neighbor of stealing your fishing net. But no, you are here to bring charges against a ghost. Specifically, a ghost that keeps showing up in your bed. This wasn't an unusual claim. In fact, the court clerks had forms for this sort of thing. The Icelandic legal tradition, especially in its rural courts, had a long-standing habit of treating supernatural problems like any other civic nuisance. Neighbors' cows wandering into your pasture? File a report. Your roof collapsed under volcanic ash? File a report. Ghost repeatedly climbing into your bed and refusing to leave before sunrise? You guessed it. File a report. And that's exactly what several Icelanders did, in cases that boggle the modern brain and yet were treated at the time with a weird and beautiful formality. One such case, recorded in 1871, features a man named Oscar Jonsson, a fisherman from the north coast who filed a written statement describing how, for over 3 months, he was engaged in unwanted nightly congress with a specter who smelled of peat and rosewater. He asked the court not for justice, but for relief. The judge, clearly confused, replied with a request for clarification on the identity and former life status of the accused, which is a fancy way of saying, "Can you name your ghost, sir?" Oscar claimed he couldn't, but he was sure she'd once lived nearby, and that her visits, while initially not unpleasant, had become exhausting. He could no longer concentrate during the day. His fishing suffered. He missed church. The spirit, he said, was clingy. His words, not ours. The court debated whether this case should be passed along to the bishop or the constable. In the end, it was recommended that the man receive spiritual counseling, and, hilariously, that he sleep in a communal bunkhouse to see if the ghost would follow. She did not. The haunting stopped. He went home. The ghost resumed. Oscar returned to court. Historians still argue whether this was a clever way of masking personal issues or a genuine cultural belief system playing out in paperwork. But the existence of the documentation is undeniable. Multiple court archives in Iceland contain statements involving unwanted spiritual contact, sometimes even involving named ghosts, former suitors, or in one unsettling case, a long-dead mother-in-law. But the legal handling of such matters wasn't always about solving a problem. Sometimes it was about preserving community sanity. If a man believed he was being visited each night, and if his neighbors feared that meant their farm was cursed, then a public statement from the court, even a vague one, served a purpose. It reassured people that their world still made sense, even when it very much didn't. Michel Foucault might call this the domestication of the irrational, or the polite bureaucracy of the uncanny. In any case, Iceland developed a tone for these court records that was, depending on your perspective, either deeply respectful or absurdly deadpan. Take, for example, the 1853 case involving two sisters who both claimed to be having dreams involving the same ghost. The ghost, a former farmhand who died during a snowstorm, allegedly visited one of them on even nights and the other on odd ones. The sisters eventually argued over whose haunting was more intimate. The case went before a local elder. His ruling? The matter is not appropriate for daylight discussion, but both should keep their doors closed. Now there's a courtroom drama I'd like to see adapted for stage. Meanwhile, Peter Webb's writing again finds relevance. He discusses how folklore, especially that of the erotic or mystical kind, is often a safe space where cultures explore contradictions between the sacred and the profane, between desire and danger, between what is remembered and what must remain buried. Iceland's legal ghost stories are a perfect example of this. They are at once absurd, earnest, communal, and profoundly intimate. And in a culture that prizes storytelling, where sagas were once carved into memory before they were ever inked on vellum, even the most private encounter could end up in the public record if the ghost overstayed her welcome. You imagine yourself now drafting one of these complaints, dipping a quill into ink, carefully writing, "To the magistrate of the North Fjord District, greetings. I humbly request assistance in matters concerning nightly spectral interruptions, which have left me fatigued and, if I may say, emotionally confused." Would they laugh? Probably not. They'd log the report, stamp it, add it to a leather-bound volume alongside entries about sheep theft and snow damage. Because in Iceland, Even ghosts get filed properly. The fire crackles again, just barely. You're still wrapped in your imaginary Icelandic wool, but now the warmth feels different, more ancient, like it's come not from wood, but from centuries of whispered stories and quietly scandalous sermons. Because tonight, we're stepping into one of the strangest intersections in all of Icelandic folklore, where ghost sex meets witchcraft. Oh yes, you thought things were already weird? Welcome to the midnight collision of wind, magic, and spectral seduction. Grab your cloak. Let's rewind to the 1600s. A bleak, snow-choked year in a northern fjord village where most people are too cold or too busy not dying to gossip much. But then a woman named Ragnheiður is brought before the local thing. Yes, the thing, Iceland's historical court assembly, on charges of consorting with spirits. Not just any spirits, mind you. She is accused of having tempted a ghost into her bed using forbidden spells. This isn't even the most outrageous part. The detail that really bothers the court is that she seems fine with it. She doesn't cry. She doesn't confess. In fact, she calmly explains, while darning a sock probably, that she did in fact call upon a spirit. And he did in fact respond. And yes, he visited her, multiple times at night. But she denies that it was sinful. It was quiet, she reportedly said, and kind. Now, you might expect torches and pitchforks here, but Iceland's witchcraft trials, unlike the fiery messes in places like Germany or Salem, were often colder, quieter, and weirder. Most accused witches were men. The magic was practical. Weather spells, protection charms, stuff involving sheep. And the punishments, while severe, were rarely about sexual transgressions, until cases like Ragnheiðr's started showing up. You see, once Christianity arrived in full Nordic force, everything had to be labeled. Dreams had to be sins. Strange touches had to be confessions. And sensual night visitations? Oh, those definitely had to be the devil. Which meant if you said a ghost visited you in the night and made you feel something, you had a choice. Say it was a dream, or get branded a witch. Historians still debate whether people like Ragnheiður were making symbolic claims, masking trauma, or just really didn't want to name names. But the records are full of similar accusations. A shadowy man appearing after dusk, a mysterious scent lingering in the bedclothes, goosebumps with no chill. The church, not known for its flexibility on supernatural intimacy, blamed incubi and succubi, the classic medieval scapegoats for any sexy dream that didn't involve your spouse. But Iceland had its own twist. These visitations weren't always terrifying. In fact, some were described in terms that sound almost romantic. One woman in 1627 described her spirit visitor as warm as the hearth and quieter than my husband. Oof. Foucault, in The History of Sexuality, notes that sexual norms were often policed not just in life, but in fantasy. Your dreams were considered part of your moral ledger. If you dreamed it, it meant you wanted it. If you wanted it, you were guilty. And if a ghost showed up in that dream, well, better pray it wasn't Lucifer in disguise. But the Icelandic countryside had a way of resisting strict religious categories. People still passed down Galdrish to fear, magical staves drawn in soot or carved into driftwood. These symbols could do anything from protect your sheep to summon a lover, or allegedly bring back the spirit of someone you once loved or missed or couldn't forget. You find yourself now in a small turf church, tucked into the side of a hill. Inside, there's a faint smell of mildew, candle wax, and regret. A sermon is being delivered in an even tone. The priest is warning the congregation against temptation, against pride, and oddly specifically, against entertaining ghosts of the flesh. You try not to laugh. Outside, the wind howls. The hills hum with things older than the church. Back at the hearth, you leaf through Sex with Kings by Eleanor Herman. She writes about monarchs who believe they were visited in the night by past lovers or ethereal beings who advised them on matters of state, and sometimes pleasure. These accounts weren't ridiculed, they were respected. In Iceland, however, the same kind of story could get you fined, flogged, or politely ignored by your entire village. But here's the twist. Not everyone the accusation. There are recorded cases of people boasting about their ghostly affairs. One man in 1671 claimed he was chosen by a spirit. He even described her perfume. Another, more modest, simply said he woke feeling satisfied and blessed. Both men were investigated. Neither were punished. The authorities didn't know what to do with people who liked their ghosts. Which leads us to a particularly odd case from the Westfjords, a widow who moved into a cottage long believed to be haunted. She told no one for months what was happening. But then, in a letter to her sister, she wrote, "I am not lonely. He still sings." That letter was intercepted. She was brought in for questioning, but she refused to deny it. In fact, she said, "If it's sin, then let me keep sinning. The bed is warmer with him here." Peter Webb might call that erotic defiance. The rest of us might call it spooky romance. Either way, the ghost stayed, and she lived there happily until her death. You stir slightly, the blanket pulling snug around your shoulders. There's a sound outside, a rustle that could be wind or something else, but you don't open your eyes. Let the ghosts dance outside. Let them press their hands to the window. You'll dream of them later. Your eyes remain closed, but your ears are wide awake. The wind has quieted, like it's holding its breath. The fire, if you can call it that, is now more a memory of heat than anything else. You lie still, letting your mind drift further into the realm of the quietly absurd, where love doesn't end with death, and marriages can cross the veil. Yes, tonight, you're attending a wedding. But not just any wedding. This is the story of the woman who married a ghost and meant every word of her vows. You find yourself in a small Icelandic fishing village, sometime in the early 20th century. It's the kind of place where the houses are painted bright colors, not because it's cheerful, but because in winter you need something, anything, to remind you you're still alive. There's a little yellow house at the edge of a cliff, a garden of wind-battered rhubarb, and a woman named Sigríður who always wears blue. Sigríður was young when it started. Her husband-to-be, Jón, was lost at sea before they could wed. His body was never recovered, and yet she claimed he returned, not as a ghost in the shadows, not a fleeting dream, but as a full presence, visible only to her. She told no one at first, because you don't just walk into the local bakery and say, "By the way, I'm seeing someone. He's very quiet. Also, he's dead." But over time, the signs became harder to ignore. Neighbors noticed she never looked lonely. She stopped attending church, but set out 2 chairs at dinner. She sang to someone while knitting. And one night, a passing fisherman claimed to see candlelight flickering in patterns that weren't possible from just one person moving through a room. Eventually, when asked why she hadn't remarried, Sigríður replied calmly, "I am married. I just didn't need a priest to say so." Now, you might expect the village to react with mockery or suspicion. But this is Iceland, a place where roads are rerouted to avoid disturbing invisible elves. A woman marrying a ghost? That's Tuesday. Still, the tale reached the ears of curious scholars. In 1938, an Icelandic folklorist interviewed Sigríður and recorded her story. She described Jón's return in vivid detail, how he smelled of salt and weathered wood, how he touched her hair while she slept, how they spoke without speaking. She said he didn't always appear in full form, sometimes just his voice, sometimes the pressure of a hand, but he was there. She was certain, and she refused every proposal that came after. A handsome Danish merchant offered her security. A local widower offered his farm, but she declined them all. "I already have a husband," she'd say, as if they'd simply forgotten. Historians still argue whether this was grief, delusion, performance, or something else. But Peter Webb's writing reminds us that in many cultures, the erotic and the ghostly are not opposites. They're neighbors. Shared breath and silent longing, unseen touches and remembered warmth. And in Iceland, where emotions often run deep beneath a still surface, like lava under frost, such stories aren't laughed at, they're respected. Because what is love, if not something that refuses to end just because a body does? In fact, Sigríður's case was one of several recorded in the early 20th century, where women, often widowed or betrothed to the lost, claimed ongoing relationships with their dead beloveds. Some even described these relationships as better than those they'd had with the living. "He listens more now," one woman wrote in a diary. "He never interrupts." That might say more about Icelandic men than ghosts, but still. There's also the peculiar legal aftermath of these cases. In at least 2 instances, families went to court to contest inheritance claims because the widow refused to remarry, insisting that her husband had not truly left. The courts didn't officially recognize ghost marriages, no shock there. But they also didn't press too hard. In one judgment, the magistrate wrote simply, "The widow believes she is not alone. The court has no opinion." Now that's a masterclass in bureaucratic neutrality. You roll over in your bed, letting the blanket rise like a second skin. The air feels thicker now, not heavier, just fuller, like someone sitting nearby, watching, not menacingly, just waiting for you to speak first. Maybe it's Jon, maybe it's someone who once wore necropants. You never know in Iceland. There's something undeniably tender about these stories, a soft, aching refusal to let go. Love is something that doesn't end, but simply changes shape, becomes quieter, becomes wind, becomes touch without form. Eleanor Herman writes about royal mistresses who clung to dreams of their lovers long after their deaths, who felt their presence beside them, guiding decisions, warming beds. But what was seen as romantic at Versailles was often pathologized in peasant life. Unless, of course, you lived in Iceland, where no one tells you what you can't love. Not if you're persistent. Sigríður lived alone for most of her life, but she never claimed to be lonely. Even when she grew old and her body slowed, she'd hum lullabies at night. Her neighbors said her windows glowed long past midnight. Her cat always stared into corners. When she died, there was a blue dress laid out next to her bed, the one she said she wore on her wedding night. You let yourself drift now, lulled by the idea that somewhere, on a rocky coast wrapped in fog, a man who never came home from the sea still walks into the same small cottage every night. And there, in the hush of candlelight, someone is waiting. You're deeper now, not just in sleep, but in story. That soft place between dreaming and remembering. And the ghosts, they've stepped aside, just a little, to let someone else through. Because in Iceland, not everything that visits your bed at night is dead. Some of them are still very much alive, sort of. Let's dim the lantern a little more and open the creaky door to the Huldufolk, the hidden people, the quiet residents of Iceland's lava fields and grassy knolls. And tonight, they're not just curious about your garden gnome placement. They're curious about you. You've probably heard of them before, often mistranslated as elves, but these aren't the jingly hat shoe-mending types. The Huldufolk are their own thing. Tall, beautiful, slightly eerie beings who live in parallel with us, just out of sight. And according to centuries of Icelandic tales, they don't just steal your spoons or hide your mittens. Sometimes they climb into your bed. Imagine this. It's 1885 in a small coastal village, the kind of place where the wind is your constant roommate and the sheep outnumber people 10 to 1. A teenage boy named Thorstein runs barefoot through the frost to the priest's house in the middle of the night. He's pale, wide-eyed, and clutching a blanket like it's a shield. The priest opens the door, already half-dressed. Thorstein blurts out his confession. She came back again. He doesn't mean a living girl. He means her, the same woman he's been seeing in dreams and sometimes, he swears, in waking moments. Tall, black hair like riverstone, eyes that glow just a little. She never speaks, but he always understands. He feels her breathe, feels her hands. She doesn't come through the door. She's just there. The priest, unfazed, nods slowly and says, "Put this under your pillow." He hands him a small Bible and a blessed sprig of angelica. And remember, the priest adds, they don't visit just anyone. Because being visited by the Huldufolk isn't always a curse. In fact, in many parts of Iceland, it's considered an honor. Some families believe that being chosen by one of the hidden people marks you as special, favored. Some even claim it runs in the blood. Great-grandmother saw them in her dreams. Now you do too. And if they like you, they might not just watch. They might join you. There's a recorded tale from the 1700s, buried in a manuscript tucked away in a regional archive, about a woman named Ingibjorg. She was unmarried, childless, and reportedly the happiest woman in her village. When asked why she never took a husband, she'd simply say, "I have one. You just can't see him." She set 2 places at the table every night. She made 2 cups of tea. One was always left untouched, physically. But villagers said they saw steam curl upward from both. The priest tried to intervene once. He told her she was living in sin with a phantom. She replied, "Then I'll go to hell, warm and loved." There's something deeply Icelandic about that answer. Historians still argue whether these stories were metaphors for loneliness, hallucinations caused by the long dark winters, or early expressions of dissociative grief. But others see something more, a cultural echo of the Old Norse belief in parallel realms, Midgard for humans, Alfheim for the hidden folk, two worlds brushing fingertips beneath the auroras. You walk now along a black sand beach, real or imagined. The waves hum like distant voices, and behind a rock, just for a second, you see her, or him, or them. A figure that disappears the moment you try to name it. There's another tale, one collected in the early 1900s by a folklorist traveling through the Westfjords. A young man, barely 20, swore he had a relationship with a woman who only arrived at night. She came when the moon was full. She spoke no words but sang softly in a language he couldn't understand. He described her touch as both colder and warmer than anything human. When asked why he believed she was one of the Huldufolk, he said, "Because she asked me not to tell anyone, and I did, and she vanished for a month." The folklorist wrote the tale down with a note, not insane, just honest. Even Peter Webb in the Erotic Spirit Through History notes that across cultures, humans have long linked sensual experience to spirits, not in horror, but in longing. Ghosts, fae, angels, demons, whatever name we give the invisible, we've always imagined they might be watching and maybe wanting. In Iceland, that idea feels especially close, like the fog just beyond the fence line, like the weight in your bed when no one else is home. And it wasn't always men telling these stories. Women, too, whispered of visitations. One story, handed down orally in eastern Iceland, tells of a widow who claimed a figure would come to her in dreams, familiar but different, gentle but firm. She believed it was not her husband returned, but someone else, someone older, one of the hidden people. She said he never stayed until dawn, but always left her remembering things I'd never lived. Foucault might argue this is just a cultural valve for suppressed emotion. Maybe, but Icelanders never seemed eager to suppress. They recorded, they shared, they passed the stories down as warnings or invitations. Even today, more than half of Icelanders say they wouldn't build a house on land believed to be inhabited by Huldufolk. And modern reports, though less public, still happen. People waking with the scent of thyme or wet moss in their sheets, unexplained footprints in frost, a lingering warmth on the pillow beside them. Maybe it's a dream, maybe it's memory, or maybe, as the old folks say, they're just checking in. You lie back again, letting the blanket rise over your shoulder. The wind presses softly against the glass, and just for a moment you swear you hear someone singing outside, a tune you don't know, but that somehow knows you. You're beginning to wonder if the ghosts ever really leave, or if they just take turns, shuffling behind the curtains of your dreams like actors in a midnight play. But now let's dim the lights even further and slip into a chapter where belief tries to wear a lab coat, and Iceland, in its wonderfully baffling way, tries to science the supernatural. It's the early 1900s, and Reykjavik is, well, still mostly fish and frost. But a new breeze is blowing in. Enlightenment ideas have arrived late but loud, and they've brought something curious with them: ghost hunters. That's right. Long before reality TV and creaky basement EMF meters, Icelandic intellectuals, some priests, some doctors, some amateur botanists for reasons unclear, began forming small, serious-minded clubs to investigate what they called visitation phenomena. And among their most curious interests, erotic hauntings. Yes, the same ghostly bedtime companions who once appeared in sagas and whispered confessions now found themselves under the glare of controlled experimentation. Kind of. You're sitting now in a chilly drawing room off Skólavörðustígur Street. It's dim, smelling faintly of pipe smoke and peat, with thick woolen curtains drawn against the snow. 4 men and 1 woman, clad in layers and furrowed brows, gather around a table with notebooks, ink, and an old copper thermometer. Because apparently, that's how you detect ghosts. Temperature drops. The test subject, a widow named Guðlaug, has reported recurring bedside sensations, not sleep paralysis, not dreams, but actual time visitations she insists are real. The investigators set up in her home, recording the hours she falls asleep, tracking changes in room temperature, even allegedly attempting to capture her visitor using ash on the floor to detect footsteps. No prints, no shapes. But the candle, they note, flickered at precisely 2:11 a.m. when Guðlaug gasped awake and said, "He's here." Peter Webb, in his work on spiritual eroticism, writes about the emergence of scientific ghost hunting didn't dispel belief, it just gave it new vocabulary. Terms like energy transference and sensory residue replaced haunting and possession. But at the heart of it, people were still asking the same thing. What is touching me when I'm alone? Gudlaug's case was never proven, of course. But her notes, written in a flowing hand with the precision of someone who's both mortified and determined, survive in a museum archive. She describes sensations of warmth, weight, and the inexplicable feeling of being watched with tenderness, not hunger. One night, she writes, her spectral visitor sat beside her, not in bed but in a chair. He watched me sleep. I felt safer than I had in years. The investigators noted nothing abnormal, but still, they returned the next night. These ghost hunting clubs popped up all over Iceland between 1905 and 1920. Some were casual, curious townsfolk with notepads and wild imaginations. Others were more formal, aligning with spiritualist movements popular in Europe at the time. They conducted seances, logged interactions, and in at least one case tried to provoke a romantic ghost into showing up by placing out a glass of wine and a love letter. He didn't show. Or maybe he was shy. Historians still debate whether these movements were sincere or just cold-weather hobbies for overly literate villagers, but they were taken seriously by some. Icelandic newspapers even published haunting logs, including accounts of spectral figures seen caressing bedposts, whispering lullabies, or lying beside sleepers, leaving behind only the scent of wood smoke or dried lavender. Even the church got involved. A few progressive clergy members attempted to merge theology and parapsychology, arguing that spirits might indeed exist in a layer of God's creation not yet charted. One priest, in a sermon delivered to an audience of mostly confused fishermen, described the possibility that some desires live beyond death, and perhaps that is not damnation, but devotion. Now there's a line to embroider on a pillow. But let's return to the science, or the attempt at it. A particularly odd experiment, recorded in the journal of an amateur Icelandic naturalist named Eiríkur, involved placing salted fish in different corners of a haunted bedroom to track spectral appetite. The results were inconclusive, except for one piece that disappeared, prompting Eiríkur to write, "Either the ghost is fond of cod, or the cat is clever." To this day, his descendants are still unsure. The point wasn't always to find answers. Sometimes it was about documenting the strangeness, giving form to the formless, saying yes, something happened, and it mattered. In the history of sexuality, Foucault reminds us that knowledge systems, scientific, religious, folkloric, aren't separate. They're overlapping maps trying to chart the same dark country. Iceland, with its open curiosity and archival obsession, tried to chart that country one footstep, one flickering candle, one phantom touch at a time. So now, you find yourself curled up again, alone but not lonely, in your imagined Reykjavik cottage. You're under a thick pile of blankets, listening for the creak of floorboards that might mean someone or something has arrived. But nothing stirs, except the air, warmer now, as if someone is watching again, with no hurry, with no fear. Maybe they're taking notes. You stretch slightly under your blanket, lulled not just by the rhythm of wind outside, but by the soft hum of stories that somehow feel more real than the room around you. At this point, you're used to the idea of visitors from beyond. But Iceland, ever the overachiever in spectral oddities, isn't done surprising you. Because now, we arrive at the sermons. Yes, the pulpit. The place where fire and brimstone declarations echo against timber walls. But in 17th century Iceland, it was also the stage for some deeply awkward conversations. Like the time a priest warned his parish that enjoying ghostly visitations too much might in fact lead to eternal damnation. Or worse, reputation damage. You're in a small turf-roofed church in the winter of 1663. Snow piles high around the windows. Inside, villagers sit shoulder to shoulder on hard benches, bundled in layers of homespun wool. The priest, a red-cheeked man with a beard like a tangled broom, clears his throat and begins his sermon. It's not about theft, not about envy, not even about the usual don't drink until you forget your cousin's name business. Today's topic, the sins of the bedchamber when visited by spirits. A low murmur rises. Everyone knows what this means. It's not about Satan. It's about Anna, 3 rows back, who once admitted she dreamed of a ghost kissing her neck. and Bjorn, whose old house is said to breathe when he sleeps alone. The priest warns, they are not your lovers, they are not your comfort, they are tests, and you must not pass them. He's talking, of course, about those nighttime encounters we've now seen reported across Iceland for centuries, where something unseen enters a room, slides under the blanket, and doesn't always take no for an answer. But here's the twist. Not everyone was afraid. In fact, some were a little too interested. Peter Webb explores this fascinating line in the erotic spirit through history, noting how sensuality and the supernatural often become tangled in a culture's effort to control bodies, especially female ones. If desire is sinful, then desire from beyond the grave? Double points. In Iceland, women who reported ghostly intimacy were sometimes seen as victims, sometimes as witches, but just as often as complicit. Too eager, too dreamy-eyed. She smiled when she spoke of it. One neighbor wrote in a journal, scandalized. She did not seem ashamed. So priests got louder. The sermons got darker. There's a document from 1681 where a bishop advised all unmarried women to avoid sleeping in linen not blessed by the church, lest it attract spirits of carnal longing. That's right, ghosts apparently are picky about thread count. But the warnings weren't only for women. In a seaside village near Seyðisfjörður, a farmer named Thorvaldur was called before the local council after confessing to repeated nighttime visitations. He was ashamed at first. Said he tried prayer, tried sleeping on the floor, tried salt circles and holding his breath. But the spirit, who he described as beautiful and unrelenting, kept returning. Eventually he stopped resisting. And then he stopped apologizing. He told the priest, calmly and without shame, I'm not cursed. I'm cared for. She brings me dreams I never had in life. The priest nearly fainted. That confession was copied into several church records as a warning tale, but Thorvaldur lived the rest of his life in peace, reportedly happier than before. Historians still debate if the tale is exaggerated or simply an honest account of a man who found company in the dark. But either way, it rattled enough pulpit furniture to inspire 4 sermons on the matter in one winter alone. And if you think Iceland moved past all this, think again. Even into the 19th century, pastors were still giving whispered side lectures about temptation through dreams. Some advised young people to sleep with Bibles under their heads and wool in their ears, lest they be seduced by murmurs in the dark. Others recommended ice baths or abstinence from root vegetables. Because as you may have gathered, Icelandic folk theology didn't always draw a clear line between the spiritual, the physical, and the deeply practical. Meanwhile, women continued to share their experiences with each other, quietly. Some considered the encounters shameful, others spiritual, a few even empowering. He does not speak, wrote one woman in a preserved letter from 1820, but he listens. Michel Foucault might call this the reclaiming of narrative, when a society's forbidden experiences slip out of control and into the arms of myth, where they're safer, less punished, more poetic. You shift under your blanket. Somewhere in your mind, you're still sitting in that little church, hearing the priest raise his voice against the seductive trap of spirit caresses. But no one moves to leave. Some eyes glance toward the rafters, others toward the snow-laced windows. They're wondering, waiting. Maybe someone will visit them tonight. Maybe they already have. And as the final hymn echoes through the church, cold, cracked, and hauntingly beautiful, you realize something. This isn't a warning. It's an invitation. You're still warm beneath your blanket, but the chill in the air tonight is different. Not harsh, just watchful. You feel it in your toes, in the creak of the wood, in the way the wind doesn't whistle, but listens. And in Icelandic folklore, when the sea starts listening, you know something or someone is coming up from the depths. Let's take a moment to dive into one of the strangest, slipperiest corners of Icelandic bedtime tales, the seductive selkie. You might have heard of selkies in Scottish folklore, those seal folk who slip off their skins and dance on the beach under moonlight. But Iceland's versions are less ballet, more bedroom. Here, the sailor folk, or seal people, are known for their trickery, their mystery, and on occasion, their steamy nighttime visits. Picture this. You're standing on a rocky cliff in the Westfjords, waves crashing far below. It's late, later than late, and a young woman stands at the edge of the shore, her dress snapping in the wind. She's looking out over the black water, whispering something you can't quite hear. The story goes that a seal followed her home. Not literally, not with flippers, but as the sun set, the seal shed its skin and walked from the ocean as a man. Tall, dark, dripping, and very persuasive. He said he'd heard her calling, that her loneliness had rippled across the waves, that he came to answer. They spent the night together. He returned to the sea by morning, but she claimed she saw him again, many times, and that every time it rained, she smelled salt and remembered. Now, this isn't an isolated story. Throughout Iceland's coastal villages, there are tales of women who claimed encounters with seal men, and men who swore that the beautiful, wordless women they met near tidal pools were not human, but didn't care. These stories blur into sensual myth almost instantly. The selkie isn't always welcome, but they're rarely monstrous. They're seductive, slippery, emotionally unavailable sea gods with amazing cheekbones. Think Poseidon meets your most haunting ex. One particular account, written in the 1890s by a schoolteacher in Vopnafjörður, tells of a man who found a strange skin near the shore. Believing it to be from a selkie, he hid it, because the legends say if you steal their seal skin, they're bound to stay with you. And she did. She became his wife. She cooked, she sang, she watched the horizon like it owed her an apology. But at night, he claimed, she would change. She would lie beside him, half there, half distant, her eyes too reflective, her touch too smooth, her scent always of brine. He said he loved her, but he never let her near the skin, until one day she found it. And like smoke on the sea, she was gone. Peter Webb, in his discussion of erotic folklore, writes that these tales are less about seals and more about longing, the desire for something other, for something unknowable and untouchable. The selkie is a metaphor for fleeting love, for intimacy that can't stay, for bodies that belong to elements we can't hold. But in Iceland, these aren't just metaphors, they're possibilities. Fishermen swore they heard voices singing under the hulls of their boats. Women left kelp on their windowsills to attract the seal men. Children were born with wide, glassy eyes and soft patches of skin that refused to tan. Historians still argue whether these tales came from real encounters, wild dreams, or the isolation of sea-wrapped winters. But the detail, the intimacy, the repetition across generations, they all suggest something deeper. A woman in a preserved letter from 1804 writes to her sister, "I do not dream of Jon anymore, only the man with the salt-stained hair who kisses me before storms." Now imagine that, being kissed by the sea itself. Of course, not all selkie stories are gentle. Some speak of visitors who came uninvited, of dreams turned sour. One chilling folktale tells of a selkie who returned to claim his half-human child, dragging both mother and baby into the waves. Others hint that those who lie with sea folk never truly feel warm again, that something cold is left behind in their bones. Still, many stories end softly. In one, a widow builds a bench near the shore and waits each night, combing her hair with a fishbone comb. She says nothing, but on particularly windy nights, the sea hushes itself, and sometimes, just sometimes, a ripple of footprints appears on the sand, wet, fading too fast. In The History of Sexuality, Foucault touches on the role of silence in desire, that the unsaid, the taboo, the imagined, these are just as powerful as the spoken. Iceland's selkie stories are soaked in silence, the kind that hums in your ears long after you've forgotten the words. You lie back, letting the idea of it all wash over you like tide on basalt. The bed rocks gently, even though the house is still. The air smells faintly of salt, or maybe that's your imagination again. You wonder, if you left your window open, would someone come in? Not a ghost this time, not a spirit, but something older, wiser, more liquid. You listen, not for knocking, but for waves. The waves have receded now, leaving only damp silence in their place. Your room is still, but your mind is far from it, drifting across stories that blur time, memory, and reality into something oddly comforting. You've journeyed with ghosts, been watched by hidden people, and kissed by sea lovers. Now it's time for something different. Tonight we're headed into one of the strangest legal records in Icelandic folklore, the case of the man, his boat, and the ghost who just wouldn't let him rest. We begin in the port town of Ísafjörður, early 1900s. The streets are narrow, steep, and icy. Fish hang drying on racks outside windows, and the whole place smells like brine and boot leather. This is where we meet Magnus, a fisherman in his mid-30s with a spectacular beard and an even more spectacular problem. Magnus is exhausted, but not from fishing or from weather. No, he's exhausted from intimacy with a ghost. He's tried everything, sleeping on the boat, sharing bunks in the fishery, wrapping himself in garlic, though that might have been more for the mosquitoes. Still, night after night, the same ghost visits him. She is, according to Magnus's highly detailed and oddly poetic deposition, a figure formed of fog and scent. She sings softly, though her mouth never moves. She wraps herself around me and speaks in thoughts. This might sound romantic, until you realize Magnus has not slept in 4 months. His fishing partners are concerned. He forgets his knots. He miscounts herring. He once tried to salt a boot. So he does what any rational Icelandic man would do in this situation. He files a complaint to the municipal council against the ghost. Now, Icelandic bureaucracy, bless its eternal patience, does not laugh. Instead, they send a local investigator, really just a librarian with strong opinions, who agrees to interview Magnus and inspect his boat. The results? Inconclusive. No cold spots, no ectoplasm. But the investigator does report an unsettling quiet in the sleeping cabin and the distinct scent of lilac, though no flowers were found. Magnus swears the spirit is someone from his past, a woman named Ellen, who died young, back when he was barely more than a boy. He claims she'd been promised to him, but was taken by sickness before they could marry. And now, he believes, she has returned. The council doesn't know what to do with this. They contact the local priest. The priest, rather unhelpfully, recommends prayer, abstinence, and avoiding fermented shark. This last bit may have been personal bias, but the visits continue. And here's where things get weird. Magnus begins to keep a log. Every visit, every touch, every whispered word. Over time, the entries shift. At first, they're desperate. Why won't she let me sleep? Later, they're confused. Is this grief or comfort? And finally, they become tender. I miss her less when she comes. It's not just a haunting. It's an ongoing relationship. Peter Webb might call this a fusion of erotic memory and spiritual projection, where longing takes shape and wraps itself in the form of someone once loved. Foucault might say it's the performance of forbidden intimacy through sanctioned madness. The townsfolk, they just say Magnus has gone strange. But strange is a relative concept in Iceland, where elves get voting rights and roads are rerouted around invisible people's houses. Eventually, the case reaches Reykjavik, not as a formal trial, but as a curiosity submitted to a journal of medical oddities. A doctor writes back, suggesting that perhaps Magnus is experiencing a rare form of night terror, compounded by the unique isolation of sea life and a diet of preserved cod. The journal also publishes one of Magnus's entries, edited for clarity, but unmistakably heartfelt. She presses her forehead to mine, he writes. She smells of wind and rain. She does not speak, but I remember her laugh from when we were children, playing among the fishing nets. If she is not real, then what do I lose by believing? The story doesn't have a dramatic ending. There was no exorcism, no scandal. Magnus eventually left the sea and moved inland, taking a job as a wool sorter. He lived quietly, unmarried. He was never haunted again, or at least never complained about it again. But one fisherman who visited him years later reported something odd. His room smelled faintly of lilacs, the man said, and his spare pillow was always fluffed. Historians still debate whether the tale is true, embellished, or simply one of those Icelandic fables wrapped in just enough truth to make you uncomfortable. But the journal entries exist. The municipal file, stored somewhere in a chilly archive near Akureyri, is still intact. And the townsfolk? They remember him, not unkindly. Sometimes, when the sea is still and the moon is high, old men on the docks whisper about Magnus and Ellen. They say love never dies, it just finds new hours to visit. Quiet hours, between fishing trips, between dreams. You shift now in your imaginary bunk on a gently rocking boat. There's the scent of salt and something floral in the air. Maybe it's nothing, or maybe she's already here. You're lying still, the ocean now a hush behind your eyelids. The stories have taken you far, from fog-draped hills to spectral spooning on creaky fishing boats. But now you find yourself seated somewhere very different, somewhere formal, cold, and full of silence that listens back. Tonight, you're attending the Midnight Court of Akureyri, a place where, once upon a time, spectral seduction was discussed in actual legal terms. It's the early 1900s again, and Akureyri, northern Iceland's jewel of a town, is glowing faintly under the veil of twilight. The buildings are small but proud, the roads are stone and ice, and the courthouse is the kind of place where echo and judgment go hand in hand. You imagine yourself there, inside. A small chamber lit by oil lamps. A judge with round glasses and wool gloves sits at a desk, flipping through thin papers with a kind of slow, deliberate disbelief. Because on the docket tonight is something most unusual, a man, a recurring female visitor, and the question of legal precedent for unwanted ghostly intimacy. Meet Jonas, a local baker with a knack for sourdough and a very tired look in his eyes. He's here to file a complaint, not about theft, not about livestock, not about grain shortages. No, Jonas claims he is being visited nightly by a spirit who lies beside him, whispers unintelligible lullabies, and then disappears just before dawn. He's brought witnesses. His cousin has heard voices. His maid swears she saw a woman-shaped fog drift across the flour sacks. A neighbor found handprints on a frost-covered window, too small to be Jonas's, too high for a child. And so the court listens, carefully, respectfully, which, by the way, is the most Icelandic thing imaginable. You might expect snickering. There is none. Only pens scratching on paper as the complaint is read aloud in full legal phrasing. A persistent spiritual trespass of an uninvited nature involving physical sensation and dream state interference. You almost want to applaud. The judge, who has probably handled complaints about goat feuds and snowplow delays, now has to determine if Jonas's ghost qualifies as a nuisance. If so, the town is obligated by law to assist. Historians still argue whether this trial was symbolic, procedural, or an earnest attempt to help someone at the edge of his wits. But the transcripts, lovingly preserved in Akureyri's archives, paint a picture of a community genuinely trying to understand an experience it couldn't name, but didn't want to ignore. Peter Webb would likely call this a ritual of legitimization, when something sensual and socially unacceptable finds safety in the language of formality. Jonas, who cannot stop dreaming of the same woman night after night, who wakes with her voice in his ears, doesn't go to a priest. He goes to court. That tells you something about Iceland. Now here's where it gets even more curious. Instead of laughing the case out of the chamber, the judge requests a testimony from Jonas's doctor. The physician arrives, glasses fogged, smelling faintly of cloves and skepticism. He examines Jonas, declares him stressed, underslept, but not irrational. Suggests the visits may be grief-related, recommends sleep in a shared lodging as others have before. But then, the curveball. The judge calls upon a folk scholar, an elderly woman known for her knowledge of local legends and non-medical problems. She walks in wearing a coat made of stitched lamb's wool and reindeer buttons, and she listens. When asked what she thinks, she shrugs and says, if he can name her, he can banish her. If not, he must learn what she wants. That answer is entered into the record. Let that sink in. A legal court in a modernizing town acknowledged the possibility that a spirit might have needs, and that those needs might have legal consequence. The judgment? Beautifully vague. The court ruled that no physical damage has occurred, but mental stress is evident. Support is warranted. Further measures depend on recurrence, which is judicial Icelandic for, we don't know what this is, but if it keeps happening, we'll talk again. Jonas left town soon after, according to local rumor. Some say he moved inland. Others claim he took a job near a geothermal spring where the steam might hide her better. No further complaints were filed. But to this day, locals refer to that courtroom as Draugadomarin, the ghost court. And it wasn't the only one. A few more records survive. One from a woman who claimed her dead husband wouldn't stop sleeping beside her, even after she remarried. Another from a young farmhand who said a glowing figure kept stealing his breath at night. Each case treated with, if not belief, at least respect. Because here's the thing about Iceland. It doesn't always ask for proof. It asks for documentation. And once a thing is written down, once it lives in ink, it's harder to forget. You shift now in your imagined courtroom bench. The lamps flicker. The air feels heavy. Maybe someone else is here too, listening for their name to be called. Not for judgment, but for acknowledgement. Because sometimes all a ghost wants is to be taken seriously. You've been drifting in and out of this quiet dreamscape for hours now, lulled by whispers of ghosts, sea people, and things that brush your skin just when you think you're alone. But now you sit up, just slightly, as the story shifts once more, not toward folklore, but toward something even more surreal: church bureaucracy. Because once upon a time, Icelandic clergy, yes, actual priests, tried to regulate ghost sex. You might be asking, what on earth does that mean? And you wouldn't be alone. But the answer is both stranger and more detailed than you might think. It starts, as so many things do in Iceland, with the cold. We're in the year 1794, in a wind-swept rural parish, where the average person's day consists of prayer, sheep herding, and trying not to freeze. Life is simple, God is complex. And the supernatural, well, it's just another neighbor. One who might visit you at night and crawl into bed like a particularly flirty draft. Enter the church. Priests throughout the countryside were receiving an uptick in confessions, strange, whispered admissions of dreams that were too real, of spectral figures who came unbidden into rooms, into blankets, and into moments that left villagers feeling equal parts euphoric and guilty. The church, alarmed but also, let's be honest, intrigued, decided it needed to act. Not to deny these experiences, but to codify them. And so began one of Iceland's most unintentionally hilarious historical footnotes: the creation of guidelines for ghost-human intimacy. You're now seated in a tiny turf-roofed chapel lit by flickering oil lamps and warmed by the slow burn of dried sheep dung. The priest, a tall, serious man with the jawline of a Viking and the demeanor of a bureaucrat, steps into the pulpit with a document in his hand. Today's sermon? On the improper familiarity between the living and the beyond. What follows is read in a tone usually reserved for livestock theft or grain disputes. A list of church-advised rules for parishioners experiencing spectral seduction. Among them, if a spirit appears in your bed without consent, you must recite 3 psalms aloud. Do not sleep with exposed feet. This is said to invite wandering souls. Ghosts may not be engaged in conversation after midnight, especially if the subject is of the flesh. If touched below the collarbone, the encounter must be reported to clergy immediately. Do not leave out food, candles, or perfume, as these may be mistaken for romantic gestures. You can almost hear the murmurs ripple through the congregation, half disbelief, half curiosity. People clutching their shawls a little tighter, a few stealing glances at each other. Did you leave your feet out last night? Were you the one who said a ghost kissed your cheek? Historians still debate the sincerity of these directives. Were they meant as spiritual protection, a satirical overreaction, or simply an attempt to give names to things that no one dared speak aloud? Michel Foucault, in The History of Sexuality, would likely see this as a perfect case study in the policing of dreams. When desire cannot be controlled in life, it is pushed into the realm of sleep and then punished when it appears there too. In Iceland, however, things were never so black and white. The lines between dream, memory, and magic were always blurred. And when someone said they'd been touched in the night, the question wasn't always booming. Did it happen? But what should we do about it? That brings us to a particularly curious letter, preserved in the archives of the Diocese of Hólar. Dated 1812, it's written by a priest named Jónas Einarsson, who describes the case of a widow named Guðni. She claimed her late husband, Jón, had begun visiting her regularly, not just in dreams, in bed. And not merely as a whisper, but as a presence, a weight, a scent. She was not distressed, the priest writes. She spoke of him with fondness, but she has grown tired. He is enthusiastic. Not knowing what to do, Jónas turned to a senior clergyman, who advised him to perform a bed cleansing rite. This involved prayers, salt, and the liberal use of cold water. It didn't work. Guðni later wrote in a follow-up that the ghost had respected the salt, but not the schedule. She then asked, quite sincerely, whether it was truly a sin if she no longer felt alone. The priest didn't respond. Peter Webb notes in his study of erotic folklore that societies often respond to mystic intimacy not with denial, but with rules. These are not punishments, but attempts to categorize the uncategorizable, to make order out of whispers and warmths that arrive with the fog. So the church didn't burn anyone. It didn't excommunicate. It filed. It advised. It adjusted the psalms. In fact, several small pamphlets were later produced by rural priests with titles like On Spirits of the Night and Their Moral Implications and Guidance for Households Troubled by the Affectionate Dead. They offered checklists, prayers, and curious advice like, do not place lavender oil beside your bed unless widowed more than 5 years. Apparently, ghosts have rules for rebound time. You turn over now, the firelight low in your room, thinking of all those people, centuries ago, lying awake and wondering if the creak in the corner was wind or someone returning. Not to haunt, but to hold. And maybe, like Gudni, you wouldn't mind, so long as they respected the salt. The night deepens around you like a warm quilt. Outside, the wind has quieted to a breath, and even the ghosts, it seems, are taking a moment to stretch their legs. You've journeyed through trials, seal suitors, and bureaucratic exorcisms, and you might think there's nothing left that Iceland can whisper into your ear. But tonight, it's time for letters. Yes, love letters, not from kings or queens, not between secret lovers separated by war. These are more peculiar, more intimate. Because in the fishing town of Husavik, early in the 20th century, someone began a romance with a person who had already died, and she wrote it all down. This is the story of Elisabeth, a woman who lived alone in a weather-stained cottage with a turf roof that sagged slightly on one side, as if exhausted by the years. She wasn't remarkable by the town's standards, widowed young, no children, and a quiet presence at church. She wore a red scarf every Sunday, spoke with a calm that made people lower their voices when they approached, and was known to keep her garden neat even in the depths of winter. But what made her different, what made her whispered about, was what she kept beneath her bed, a box, wooden, hand-carved, sealed with a leather strap. Inside, dozens of letters, folded with care, tied in bundles with twine. Letters addressed not to friends, not to politicians, not even to family, but to him. Or as she sometimes called him in the opening lines, the one who still walks in fog, or my hush between heartbeats, or simply, you. She wrote them by candlelight, sometimes in the margins of prayer books, other times on scraps of fish wrapping paper, always in her own hand. The letters never left her home. They weren't posted, weren't intended for any earthly delivery, and yet she treated them like correspondence, with dates, greetings, closings, even the occasional apology for taking too long to reply. At first, people assumed it was grief, a way to process the loss of her husband, Jon, who drowned at sea one icy October day when the waves rose up like mountains and refused to return what they took. For a time, Elisabeth mourned like everyone else, quietly, politely. But then, the letters began. She never told anyone outright, but neighbors noticed. The postman said she always bought ink, but never stamps. The shop girl once swore she heard Elisabeth humming lullabies in a second voice. And one stormy night, a delivery boy glimpsed 2 shadows through her curtain. One seated at the desk, the other standing behind her, hand on her shoulder. The boy never returned to that house again. The letters themselves are preserved now, housed in the Civic Cultural Museum under glass. They were found after her death in 1936, tucked neatly in the box beneath the bed, along with a pressed bouquet of sea lavender and a tin of dried clove buds. And oh, the words she wrote. To you who never left begins one of the earliest. You return with the fog and lie down without sound. My dreams are warmer when you stay. Another, dated 2 years later. I woke with salt on my lips. Either I kissed the sea or you visited again. Either way, thank you. Some letters describe memories, walking together by the docks, his hand in hers, a shared laugh over a dropped basket of potatoes. But others, they describe moments that could not have happened in life. A kiss in a room locked from the inside. The weight of an arm over her waist as she slept. A song, hummed against her neck, that she swore she did not know until that moment. Peter Webb, in The Erotic Spirit Through History, might call these letters acts of healing. Not delusion, but devotion. A way for the bereaved to reclaim their narrative, not of loss, but of continued connection. In many cultures, intimacy with the dead is taboo. In Iceland, it is simply unusual, and there's more. Tucked between her own letters were others, not many, just 5 actually. 5 pages, written in a distinctly different hand, slanted, slightly larger, and always unsigned. These reply letters were never explained, but they matched her paper, her ink, her box, and they were addressed lovingly back to her. You hum while you stir the soup, and I follow the sound, one letter reads. I remember the warmth of your spine before dawn. You never turned, but I knew you heard me. You forgive me each night when you leave the window open. Now skeptics say she wrote both sides, created her ghost, gave him a voice. Historians still debate whether these were private poems, grief rituals, or just a woman with a vivid imagination. But the townsfolk, they believe. One former neighbor, long since retired, recalled seeing footprints in the frost on her doorstep. Bare, long, too wide for any woman, but leading directly to her front door and stopping there. Another swore that during a harsh winter storm, while everyone's chimneys smoked gray, hers puffed pale blue, like something else was burning. Something. Not of this world. Even the museum archivist who cataloged her box said the air turned oddly warm whenever he handled the letters. One of them, he swears, was still slightly damp when he opened it, like it had only recently been folded. And in the margins of her final letter, dated just a week before her death, Elisabeth wrote the words, I will see you soon. Don't blow out the candle. I'll need it to find you. You lie back now imagining her cottage. The quiet hum of wind, the small flame flickering beside her desk, and someone behind her, always behind her, silent but not absent. If you were to write a letter tonight, who would it be to? And if you slid it under your pillow, would someone come to read it? The hush is heavier now, not like a weight, but a blanket, thick, soft, and lined with stories you didn't know you were carrying. You're nearly asleep, nearly drifting, when suddenly the roof of your mind lifts and you're looking up into a sky so strange, so alive, it could only belong to Iceland. The northern lights, aurora borealis, curl overhead in waves of green, purple, and silver. They move not like light, but like thought, like memory, like longing. And in Icelandic folklore, they are much more than beautiful. They are open doors. You shift slightly beneath your imagined sheepskin covers, eyes half-lidded, mind wide open, and you remember what one Icelandic grandmother might have whispered over a pot of fish stew. Don't sleep under the lights unless you're ready to be remembered. The old tales say that the aurora doesn't just appear, it awakens things. Not just spirits of the dead, but forgotten emotions, unfinished desires, and memories that never quite faded. And in the right moment, on the right night, when the sky ripples just so, it might bring someone back. Not fully, not loudly, but just enough. You find yourself now in a turf house on the northern coast, a thin pane of handmade glass above your bed. Outside, the aurora is turning the snow green. Inside, the light dances across your ceiling like someone invisible is pacing gently overhead. In 1857, a priest living near Laxmývatn recorded something strange in the margin of his devotional journal. Not a sermon, not a confession, just 6 lines. Tonight she spoke. The lights were bright. Her voice came soft like wind in wheat. She said she'd found me. She missed the soup. He never explained who she was, but scholars have long guessed it was his wife, long deceased, or perhaps someone he never married. Someone whose memory drifted just far enough from the conscious mind to become welcome again only when the sky changed color. In those days, Icelanders believed the lights were more than weather. They were signs, paths. Some believed they lit the way for souls to travel from one world to the next. Others thought they were expressions of divine emotion, joy, sorrow, desire, written across the stars in shifting silent calligraphy. And some thought they were lovers. One elderly woman in Siglufjordur told a folklorist in the 1930s, "When the lights dance, I feel him again. He never liked dancing in life, but now he does." Her husband had died decades earlier. There's even a story, recorded in both oral and written versions, about 2 lovers who made a pact before one of them went to sea. "If I die," he said, "wait for me when the sky glows. Leave the window open." She did, and each time the lights came, she said she heard footsteps, felt the bed sheets shift, smelled fish and wool and salt and the faintest trace of pipe smoke. She never remarried. "He comes home enough," she told the priest. Peter Webb, reflecting on spiritual desire, argues that intimacy with the dead often reveals more about the living than the afterlife. That longing, when wrapped in ritual and repetition, becomes its own form of relationship. And in Iceland, nothing amplifies longing quite like aurora-lit solitude. Scientific explanations? Sure. Magnetic fields, solar flares, charged particles colliding with atmospheric gases. But even modern Icelanders, those with degrees and data, will sometimes say, yes, yes, but still, they feel like someone is watching. The link between aurora and intimacy appears in unexpected places too. In an anonymous letter to an Icelandic newspaper in 1924, someone wrote, "I never dreamed of him until the sky burned green. Then I felt his hand again, not in sorrow, in warmth." The editor declined to publish it, but the letter remains archived. Even the church, which spent centuries trying to stamp out any excitement about spectral cuddling, had to address the phenomenon. One priest warned in an 1810 sermon not to linger in the glow of unnatural colors, for they stir the body and confuse the soul. Another, more poetic, wrote in a diary, "If God did not wish us to feel during the lights, why did he make them move like skin?" There are darker tales, of course. Some believe that the aurora could invite the wrong kind of attention. That if you slept with your chest uncovered beneath the lights, a wandering spirit might borrow your breath. A woman near Hela once claimed she awoke during an aurora with a weight on her ribs and a whisper in her ear saying, "I never finished loving you." Still, most of the stories are gentler, not hauntings, visitations. There's the case of Sigurður the herder, who slept alone in the highlands and swore the lights sang his name during winter storms. He wrote hundreds of pages in a battered journal describing dreams of a woman with silver eyes who only visited when the sky moved. His last entry, found beside his frozen body in 1899, read, "She called me home. I went." Historians still argue if this is romance, madness, or myth. But in Iceland, no one finds it odd, only familiar. Tonight you lie still beneath your imagined skylight, your room glowing softly as the lights outside swirl across the sky. You feel warm, though there's no fire lit. You feel watched, though the room is empty. Maybe the sky remembers you. Maybe you've called someone back without knowing it. Or maybe the aurora just likes the way you sleep. You're still lying there, barely tethered to wakefulness, and the stories are beginning to blur into one another. Faces you've never met but somehow remember, places that feel both ancient and intimate. The night has deepened, the fire's only an ember, and the aurora has slipped behind a bank of snow-thick clouds. But you're not alone. Not quite. Because now comes a story not of visits, but of residence. Not the sudden appearance of a ghost, not the shock of a midnight whisper, but the long, soft, daily presence of someone who should have gone and didn't. Tonight, we enter the realm of draugagangur, a phenomenon known in Iceland as the walking of the ghost. But don't imagine chain clanking or banshee howls. This isn't that kind of haunting. There is no drama here, only routine, only someone staying. You're now in a farmhouse somewhere in the moss-covered valleys of southern Iceland. The year is 1807. The walls are thick with turf, the windows are small and icy, and the air inside smells of smoke, lamb fat, and something faintly wrong. The woman of the house, whose name was Ashdis, has taken to writing notes. Not letters, not journal entries. Just small slips of lambskin parchment placed in odd corners, behind the hearthstone, beneath the pillow, tucked into the space between the wooden beams. Each reads a quiet message. You may rest now. Or sometimes, you are loved, but you do not belong here anymore. She writes them for her husband, Jon, who died 3 years earlier in a fishing accident. Or at least he was supposed to have. At first it was just small things. A mug moved overnight, a chair angled strangely toward the fire, the smell of pipe smoke in a room no one had entered. The dog began sleeping outside. The bread refused to rise unless the oven was blessed. A single footprint in the ash by the hearth. Nothing violent, nothing explicit, just presence. When visitors came, Asti said little. Only once, when asked how she was keeping up, she replied, "I am not alone in the evenings." The local priest, young and recently educated in Copenhagen, decided to take a scientific approach. He stayed the night, ate a modest supper, slept in the guest loft. He didn't stay a second night. When questioned later, he simply said, "There are some places where memory thickens. That house is one of them." Peter Webb, reflecting on the eroticism of grief, once wrote that, "A haunting is the persistence of intimacy without the permission of presence." Jon, perhaps, had never been granted permission to go. Foucault might describe it as the normalization of absence as presence, when the dead become such a consistent feature in your life that they functionally replace the living. But Astis didn't frame it as philosophy. She framed it as habit. She began setting out 2 spoons again. She started humming the song he used to sing when carving spoons. She repaired the coat he'd left hanging by the door. Because in Iceland, draugagangur isn't always about terror. Sometimes it's just the slow creep of love turned stubborn. A love so deep it forgets to leave. Another family near Bifrost reported something similar in 1832. A daughter, age 15, began waking up with frost on her eyelashes, despite being in a room warmed by 3 bodies. He watches from the threshold, she told her brother. He's not sad, just curious. The father kept a diary. In one entry he wrote, "He is not angry, he does not speak, but he sits in Joan's old chair and waits for us to forget he isn't Joan. They never ask for help." And maybe that's the heart of Draugr. These aren't ghosts that break things. They don't scream, they don't bleed, they wait and watch. And wear you down until you can't remember what your house felt like without them. By 1859, Astis had passed. The house was sold, but the new owners, farmers from the east, only lasted 2 winters. They said the walls were too warm in the night, that they heard someone walking the hall, pausing by each door, just as Jon once did to check the locks. One night, their young son claimed a man came to sit beside him, asked if he was taking care of his Astis, and then walked calmly through the closed door. The family left before spring. Today, the house no longer stands. The stones were repurposed, the turf roof collapsed. But the field where it stood, still called Jonsflut, the flat of Jon's house. Some hikers still report the sound of footfalls behind them, especially in the fog. One described it like this: "You don't hear it, you feel it, like someone else is remembering with you, as if the land has not forgotten who used to live here, and would very much like you to remember too." You lie back now, covers tucked to your chin, and you wonder, have you ever kept someone too long in your thoughts? Do you ever feel someone at the edge of your dream, not asking to come in, but simply waiting? Maybe they're not angry. Maybe they just haven't finished saying goodbye. And maybe, just maybe, you haven't either. The stories are softer now. They no longer arrive like footsteps on creaking floorboards, but like old songs on distant radios, half remembered, oddly comforting. You followed Icelandic ghosts through letters, bed sheets, prayer books, and auroras. But this one doesn't arrive to frighten or whisper or even linger. This one just continues. Tonight you meet the ghosts who haunt not people or places, but habits. In Icelandic folklore, they're sometimes called vanagangandi, those who walk in habit, not tied to dramatic deaths or curses or revenge. These are spirits who have become so accustomed to doing something in life, they forget to stop after death. You begin in a seaside village long since claimed by waves and wind. No roads lead there now, but in 1793, it was home to fishermen, wind-beaten sheep, and one boy named Oli. Oli was the kind of soul who found meaning in repetition. Every morning, he rose at 5, swept the hearth by 6, baited lines by 7, and was on the water before the gulls began screaming. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't romantic, but it was his. Until the morning, he didn't return. A storm had rolled in quick, black and low, like someone had dragged an inkwell across the sky. His boat was found cracked on the rocks, no body, just a single glove, wet and stiff with brine. His mother wept for a week. His father dug out his pipe and never spoke of it again. And life, as it always does, tried to resume its shape. But then the door creaked open. At 5, just as always. At 6, the broom by the hearth had moved. At 7, the fishing net was found, neatly coiled, untouched, not used, but prepared. The family assumed it was a neighbor being kind, until it happened again and again and again. No footsteps in the snow, no sound on the stairs, just habits repeating themselves, like muscle memory without the muscle. Peter Webb would call this the eroticism of repetition, the body's echo existing even when the body no longer does. Foucault might point to it as a metaphor for how societies internalize routine, turning memory into architecture. But here in Iceland, they just say, Oli forgot he was dead. The family never tried to banish him. They didn't call for a priest. They didn't burn sage. They simply adjusted. His mother began placing a second mug on the table, not out of fear but respect. Once, she even left a slice of fish by the stove and woke to find the fork had been moved. Oli never made a sound. He never showed himself. he simply continued. A scholar once asked, "Why did they stop it?" The granddaughter replied, "Why stop what brings no harm?" And Ollie was not alone. In Ísafjörður in 1848, a man named Magnus claimed that his brother's ghost still tended the smokehouse. Not haunting, just monitoring. He'd find the herring barrels tapped, the brine levels adjusted, once the salt bin was topped off overnight, despite the bin being empty at dusk. Magnus began leaving out a note, "Thank you." And then there was Ragnheider, a dairymaid in the Westfjords. She told a folklorist that her mother, gone 5 winters, still turned the butter. "I leave the churn ready each night," she said. By morning, it shifted a finger's width to the left. When asked if she was frightened, she simply shrugged. She was always early, even in death. These stories never involve violence. There's no unfinished business, no curses, just the gentle, haunting truth that some habits are so deeply worn into the world, they outlive the people who made them. Historians still debate the psychology of this. Some say it's projection, people seeing what they need to see. Others argue it's collective memory made physical, a kind of shared dreaming. But in Iceland, the idea is simpler, older. The land remembers, so do the hands. One Reykjavik archivist once described a visit to an old farmstead where the same door creaked every morning at 5, even though the house was empty and sealed. "We checked the frame," he said. "Perfect condition. Still opened by itself." He camped outside for a week. By the 6th morning, he said he no longer needed an alarm. The ghost, he claimed, had become a kind of friend. "It helped me write. It kept time. I almost missed it when I left." You lie there now, listening to your own heartbeat. Not a haunting, just a rhythm, just repetition. And you wonder, what routines have you carved into the world? What gestures do your hands know better than your mind? When you're gone, will they echo? Will someone fold the corner of a page the same way you do? Will a door creak just so in that rhythm only you used? Will someone someday make tea and leave the second cup untouched? And if they do, maybe you're still walking. Not loudly, not tragically, just in habit. The sky is a deeper shade of indigo now. Almost black, but not quite. That in-between blue where the first thought of dawn might stir, if only for a moment before sinking back into sleep. You're still safe, still wrapped in softness, still drifting. But just before the final story comes, there's one more truth we need to visit. Something buried, yes, but far from forgotten. Because sometimes ghosts don't come to you. Sometimes you go to them. Tonight, we enter the realm of Icelandic graveyards, and one grave in particular, a place where the earth has refused for centuries to settle, where moss will not grow, where grass shrivels, and where every so often the dirt seems to breathe. You're standing now in a churchyard outside the fishing village of Skagastrand, the sea wind biting at your cheeks. The air smells like kelp and iron. There are 36 graves here, modest mounds marked with slate or driftwood crosses, but one of them has no name, only a shallow hump in the ground, and a stone smoothed not by tools but by time. The villagers know this place. They don't walk across it. They don't picnic near it. And children are told quite firmly not to play too close, because this is Dalla's grave, or rather, it was supposed to be. Who Dalla was is a subject of local debate. Some say she was a healer, descended from a long line of folk medicine women. Others whisper she was a midwife who refused the church's supervision. A few simply say she was strange, solitary, sharp-eyed, and always speaking to things that weren't there. What's agreed upon is this. Dalla died during the winter of 1721, and from that moment onward, the ground refused to keep her. The story goes like this. She collapsed in her cottage, clutching a bundle that may have been a stillborn child, or a wrapped herb bundle, depending on who tells it. There was no priest present, no official last rites, just a young girl, her niece, who sat by her side and swears. Dalla said one thing before her final breath, "Do not bury me, let me drift with the thaw." But in Iceland, winters don't wait. She was buried the next morning, in a corner of consecrated ground, with hurried prayers in a too shallow grave. The ground was hard, the earth reluctant, and her niece never forgave the decision. And that's when it started. The following spring, her grave rose. Not dramatically, not like a hand reaching out, but enough that the ground formed a dome as if something below were exhaling. The villagers assumed it was frost heave. Natural, unusual but not impossible. But the next year it happened again, and again the next, and always the grave never flattened. Grass refused to grow. Livestock would not graze near it. And once in 1782, a visiting bishop placed his hand on the soil and said, quietly, "There is a wish here that has not been honored." Historians still argue about the phenomena. Some blame the heat vents from a volcanic shelf below the graveyard. Others suggest shifting water tables, decomposition gases, or plain coincidence. But no other grave in the yard behaves this way. Only Dala's. And then there are the dreams. Generations of villagers have claimed that Dala visits in sleep, not to haunt, not to threaten, but to remind. One fisherman said she asked him to stop using cod liver oil for wounds. Another claimed she taught him the recipe for a fever salve that cured his infant daughter. She wanted to be a teacher, he said. They wouldn't let her. Even the most skeptical began to change their minds when strange plants began to grow near the grave. Not weeds, not flowers, but medicinal herbs, wild angelica, yarrow, and one species unidentified by local botanists. Peter Webb might argue that Dala represents the erotic spirit of autonomy, a woman whose very body refused to be confined by masculine rituals of death. Michel Foucault, always drawn to power and its margins, might say her story exposes the limits of institutional control, the body as resistance, the grave as rebellion. And yet Icelandic locals wouldn't speak of her in such terms. They simply say she was not finished. In the 1930s, a school teacher spent a summer researching her. He left a journal behind, filled with interviews. One entry reads, "Old woman near the harbor said Dala still sings, told me to lie on the grave. I did. Heard wind, then not wind. My head ached for hours after." Another reads, "Tried to plant thyme. It withered in 2 days. Dala dislikes thyme." Even today, the site is visited quietly, respectfully. People leave bundles of herbs, wool, pebbles etched with runes, not offerings. Apologies, perhaps. You lie there now, half asleep, and imagine that grave, still, breathing, not trapped, not tormented, just waiting for someone to listen. Because Dala didn't want revenge. She didn't want worship. She just didn't want to be buried. And maybe, just maybe, some wishes echo longer than stone. Now the hour is late. The stories have thinned into whispers. And the ghosts, they're no longer looming. They're settling in beside you, calmly like old companions. You've walked through Iceland's oldest fears and quietest longings. But before your dreams take over entirely, there's one last stop to make. This story doesn't begin with a death. It begins with a marriage, an unusual one. Because tonight, you meet the Icelanders who didn't just claim to love a ghost, they claimed to wed one. And in a few rare cases, the ghost signed the papers. You're sitting now in a modest home in Flateyri, a fishing town folded between mountain and fjord. The wind outside rattles the driftwood gate, and the floor creaks in polite disagreement with your every step. But inside, everything is warm. Old sweaters, carved wooden furniture, a framed wedding photo on the mantel. Except the groom is missing. That's because the bride, Margaret, claimed he was already dead when they married. The story first appeared in 1903 in a letter to the editor of an Icelandic newspaper. Margaret explained that she had known her husband since she was a child. He'd lived in the house before her family and died of fever in the upstairs room. She said he visited her dreams, whispered advice, protected her from falling rocks during hikes. And when she turned 22, he proposed. No one believed her, but she still wore the ring. She set a place for him at meals, wrote letters on his behalf, even petitioned the local council for a marriage certificate. It was denied, of course. But she still used his name, Erikur, in all her correspondence. Signed everything, Mrs. Margaret E. Neighbors thought it was grief or madness or just loneliness turned ritual. But then strange things began to happen. A wedding ring appeared on her finger overnight, etched with initials that didn't match hers. A pair of men's boots was always dry, despite sitting by the storm door. And once, when asked how she spent her evenings, she said, "We play chess. He cheats." This wasn't unique. In northern Iceland, there are scattered tales of ghost marriage rituals, folk ceremonies where the living would declare a binding with a deceased lover. In some cases, it was about keeping a promise. In others, about safety, warding off haunting by honoring affection. One story from 1886 tells of a woman who lost her fiancé at sea, then wore her bridal gown for a year. On the anniversary of his death, She placed it on his grave and claimed he visited her every Sunday after. They never touched, she said, but he hummed lullabies, and she never felt alone again. Peter Webb might describe this as the eroticization of absence, the desire so strong it creates companionship from shadow. Foucault, ever skeptical, would point to it as an institutional loophole, love without legal standing, sexuality without permission. But Icelanders, they just call it loyalty, and it continues even now. A 2012 folk documentary recorded a woman in her 70s who claimed her ghost husband still folds the laundry. He was always neat, she said, sipping tea. Even death didn't change that. Skeptics roll their eyes. But who among us hasn't spoken to someone who isn't there? You breathe deep now. You think of the empty side of your bed, not sad, just unclaimed. Maybe someone's there, maybe not. But if they ever propose, remember, Iceland has precedent. And now, the sky has turned completely quiet. There's no more rustle of stories beneath your pillow. No more footsteps pacing gently across the wood floors of Icelandic memory. Just you, breathing soft in the stillness between worlds. Maybe you didn't expect all this when we started. Maybe you thought ghosts were just scary stories, flickering shadows meant to raise your heartbeat, not slow it down. But here in Iceland, ghosts are different. Quieter, closer, more polite than you think. They wait, they whisper, they continue. They fold laundry, stir soup, nudge the door shut against the wind. Not because they're trapped, but because maybe like us, they still have something gentle left to do. Tonight, you've met the ghosts who write love letters, who curl up in northern lights, who walk the same halls out of habit, and who rise from the soil not to frighten, but to breathe. You've seen how Iceland, with all its frost and fire, makes space for the strange, how it doesn't rush its dead, how it listens. And now it's your turn to do the same. So close your eyes. Let the stories float off like steam from a cup of evening tea. Let the room become lighter. Let the covers feel like moss and sky and sleep. You're safe here, even if someone else is in the room. Especially if someone else is in the room, because maybe they just want to tuck you in. Good night from the land of lava and lingering. Sweet dreams.